Hey there, Euro Bears. This particular video is about the Catholic Reformation, otherwise known as the Counter-Reformation. This particular event, if we can call it an event, it takes place over the second half of the 1500s, the 16th century, and it's the Catholic response to all the problems caused by the Reformation. So there's sort of the internal restructuring of the Catholic Church that goes along with this. The Catholics decide that they need to reform themselves to prevent any other Martin Luther rising up again. And then there's also the quest to capture back souls. All the people who converted to Protestantism, Lutheranism, or Anabaptism, or Calvinism, or whatnot, or even Anglicanism. There's a goal to bring them back. So the Catholic Reformation has these two goals in mind: reform itself so that it is no longer doing bad things like selling indulgences, and then also make sure that we're bringing back some lost souls. So that's the point of the Catholic Reformation, which is really a big movement in the second half of the 16th century and into the early 1600s as well. So the first easy thing to talk about with the Catholic Reformation is the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent, there are quite a few details of this council, which goes on for nearly 20 years. But I'm just going to give you a very general overview of it. It begins in 1545 under Pope Paul III, and really Pope Paul III calls it under pressure from Charles V, who says, we need to restructure this church so that it's, or at least, I don't know if restructure is the proper word, but we need to revisit our doctrine and our practices to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with the Bible and authority and Catholic tradition. So they meet several times over the course of 18 years. And a few big things that come out of this, and you see them listed here on this particular slide. Are the Catholics going to get rid of scripture, of tradition and authority? No. Absolutely not. So the Bible is still the Word of God, but tradition and authority of the Catholic Church will be maintained. The Latin version of the Bible is the only version of the Bible. If you want to go to heaven, you must believe and you must do good works. This is affirmed in the Council of Trent, and the seven sacraments are also affirmed. And then there's some economic cleaning up. Simony and pluralism is reduced. Let's say reduced. The selling of indulgences is redefined. I don't know, looking at my slide here, where I say forbade the sale of indulgences, I'm not sure if that's exactly true. I think what indulgences were redefined and certainly limited, and things like John Tetzel selling indulgences in that particular manner, that is forbidden. That does go away. Certain things happen, like they want to start educating people, so there's going to be seminaries in every diocese. There is a particular value placed on taking care of the poor, and the bishops are expected to actually live in the diocese in which their bishopric is located in. So in other words, you're not allowed to say I'm a bishop here and then live elsewhere, and then you're also supposed to actually preach. So those reforms are happening. Essentially, the Catholic Church is sort of just getting to its roots again and making sure that everybody is a good Christian. So this is the Council of Trent. It meets over the course of 18 years, 1545 to 1563. Probably the more interesting aspects of the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation are the people involved. And there's two really important people that I talk about. The first is, as you see here, Ignatius of Loyola, and the second one is St. Teresa of Avila. So you've read quite a bit about St. Ignatius of Loyola and Heretics and Heroes, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. You hopefully remember that he was Spanish. He also came from a noble family. He was also a little bit of a playboy. He was a wild man. I guess not a little bit, really more like a lot. He was a macho guy. He enjoyed the company of lots of girlfriends, and of course he liked to distinguish himself in battle. And it's in battle against the French in Navarre where he sustained an injury from a cannonball taking out his legs. And while he was in recovery from that, he sort of found God again. And he decided to, after this, dedicate himself to not only God, but to the Roman Catholic Church and to the protection of the Pope. So he establishes the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus. Most people call the Society of Jesus the Jesuits. So from here on out, I'm just going to call them the Jesuits. So a couple of things about the Jesuits. First of all, this institution is set up in a very militaristic hierarchy. So a lot of people look at the fact that, or a lot of historians rather, look at the fact that St. Ignatius of Loyola was a military guy. And so when he sets up the Jesuits, he sets it up as a military-like hierarchy with essentially the Pope as the High General. And your job as a Jesuit is to obey commands, to do what it is that you are expected to do. So I've got a quote here from the Constitution of the Jesuits, in which St. Ignatius of Loyola writes that all members shall realize and shall recall daily, as long as they live, that this society as a whole and in every part is fighter for God under faithful obedience to one mostly Lord, the Pope, and to other Roman pontiff as their head and as the vicar of Jesus Christ, whenever the Roman pontiff may decree regarding the welfare of souls and the propagation of the faith, we are pledged to obey without evasion or excuse instantly. So hopefully you get a sense of this is what the Jesuits are about. You obey commands. It's very militaristic. I'm going to go back to this original slide here. His book, Spiritual Exercises, is a very important book for the Jesuits and really beyond even just Catholicism. In Spiritual Exercises, St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about or writes about how you think, how you pray, what the focus of your thoughts should be as a good Christian. So this is a book about essentially cleaning up your mind and how to think clearly and how to be a good Christian. His Spiritual Exercises. And there you see the Latin cover of that particular book. All right. The Jesuits had a very profound effect on all of world history, especially as we look at this image here, which is a picture taken in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Jesuits were sent by the Pope everywhere with the goal of claiming souls, of saving souls, I guess I should say, for the Catholic Church. So remember, St. Ignatius of Loyola is Spanish. The Spanish are taking over the Americas and are creating the world's largest empire of all time ever. So the Jesuits are going to go where the Spanish go, and they're going to save souls. So whether it's to America to save the souls of the Native Americans, to China, where they have a very profound effect. China has the worst civil war in world history in the middle of the 19th century, during the exact same time that we Americans are having our civil war. And that civil war was in part caused because of the efforts of the Jesuits. It was a civil war caused by Christians in China. They go to India as well. And of course, Jesuits are very, very big in the world today. If you look in the bottom center of this slide, you've got Pope Francis there. He is a Jesuit who became Pope. And I think one of the few Jesuits to become Pope. If I'm not mistaken, he might be the only Jesuit to become Pope, but you can check me on that. The Jesuits today are known for being relatively liberal in the Catholic Church, which is very different from its founding. And they do a lot of community outreach to help people, a lot of philanthropic work and a lot of educational work. And all of this is, of course, the result of the efforts of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Our second big, very colorful person during the Catholic Reformation is this woman, also Spanish, St. Teresa of Avila. St. Teresa of Avila is important because she became a nun at a fairly young age. She was still a teenager. And as a nun, she joins the Order of the Barefoot Carmelites. And let me put it on this slide here. And when she was a nun, she's known for doing two things. One, reforming nunneries. Two, being a mystic and a writer of mysticism. So, reforming the nunneries, let me talk about that first. Nunneries, if you were a woman prior to the Reformation and you wanted to escape society, you wanted to run away from home, you wanted to avoid a marriage that you didn't want anything to do with. If there was an invading army and you wanted to go someplace safe where you wouldn't be abused by the invading soldier men, you could go for any of these reasons into a nunnery and become a nun. The result of this was, aside from living apart from society, not getting married, the women that were in there weren't necessarily in there because they wanted to be religious. So nunneries sort of became a little bit of a sorority, and there was a lot of fun maybe being had, and maybe some unchristian practices were going on. So Saint Teresa of Avila made it her goal to clean him up, to go into the nunneries and make sure that the nuns were being good nuns. And that's what she did. So she cleaned up the nunneries. That's kind of the simplest, easiest thing to remember about Saint Teresa of Avila and her role that she plays during the Counter-Reformation. If you remember, Boccaccio said a lot of colorful, lewd, scandalous things about nuns and how they were messing around with monks and stuff. Saint Teresa of Avila wants to address all this and clean it up. All right. The second thing that she's known for is being a mystic. In a similar way that, St. Ignatius of Loyola really wanted to, with the Jesuits, teach them a way to think about God. So does St. Teresa of Avila. And what St. Teresa of Avila did as a nun herself was this. She would deprive herself of food and water, seeking a mystical vision. She would lay on the floor of her cell in her nunnery, and lay herself out in the form of a crucifix, and without food, without water, engaged in constant prayer. She thought that she would levitate. She would rise up off of the ground, and she would receive mystical visions from Jesus. Now, she would write about these things and write about her practices and the visions she received. I don't think it takes much imagination to know why these things were, or why her books were incredibly popular. People wanted to read about these amazing visions that she had of Jesus. Okay, and I'll talk about those here in a second. I just want to give you a couple quotes here from St. Teresa of Avila that are popular still today among Christians. The first is this one, which is, there are more tears shed over unanswered prayers than over there are more tears shed over answered prayers than over unanswered prayers, which is a fun quote. And then the other one, which reveals her intensity, is this one, allegedly attributed to St. Teresa. Lord, either let me suffer or let me die. So here we go. Now, probably her most famous mystical vision comes from her autobiography. And I would like to read it to you and to show it to you beginning here. So when she was prostrate on the ground without food or water for however long, she has a vision. And she describes the vision here. And it's one of the most amazing things that St. Teresa of Avila ever wrote. And here's what she wrote. I saw an angel close by me, on my left side, in bodily form. This I am not accustomed to see, unless very rarely. Though I have visions of angels frequently, yet I see them only by an intellectual vision, such as I have spoken of before. It was our Lord's will that in this vision I should see the angel in this wise. He was not large, but small of stature, and most beautiful, his face burning, as if he were one of the highest angels, who seemed to be all of fire. They must be those whom we call cherubim. Their names they never tell me, but I see very well that there is in heaven so great a difference between one angel and another, and between these and the others, I cannot explain it. Then she gets even more intense in terms of what the angel actually does to her. And here she continues. I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the iron's point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual, though the body has its share in it, even a large one. It is a caressing of love so sweet which now takes place between the soul and God, that I pray God of his goodness to make him experience it, who may think that I am lying. So this is a very intense quote because it's both very physical and very spiritual all at once. And people have read a lot into this. And we'll also revisit this quote here in a little bit. St. Teresa of Avila, her life has been celebrated in many forms. And she's also the person that Mother Teresa took her name after in the 20th century. All right. The other thing that's associated with the Counter-Reformation is a new art movement. And this art movement is called Baroque art. And Baroque art can simply be defined as the art of the Counter-Reformation. Let's start there and then get into the description of the art. But first of all, check out this interesting painting here by an artist named Caravaggio. Just look at it. It's very violent and intense and gruesome. This is very different from any of the other artwork we've seen before. The Renaissance art of both the North and the South, and especially the South, was never this intense. So understand the Protestant attitude. God speaks to us through the Bible, through Scripture, and that's it. And that's it. So the Protestants, especially the radical Protestants, we're talking Anabaptist, Calvinist. The Calvinists are known as Huguenots in France and England. They're known as Puritans. When the Puritans come over to the American colonies, they are the Pilgrims. The Puritans are everywhere. And their goal is to focus exclusively on the Bible. So, Puritanism. Protestantism in its most radical form, it gets rid of all imagery. So you take a look at this church here, which is actually a church in the United States. It definitely reflects this radical Protestant or Puritan idea that we should get rid of all images. So the Catholic response to this is fantastic. If the Protestants want to get rid of beautiful artwork, so be it. That's what we're good at. We're the Catholics, man. We've got Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, all these guys were Catholics in Italy, of all places. And it's the one thing that we're really, really good at. So what we're going to do is we Catholics are going to focus on developing great artwork because this is going to bring souls back to the Catholic Church. Now, how are we going to do it? How are we going to make great artwork and make artwork that's really aimed at the masses towards bringing them back? And here's how they do it. And these are the qualities of Baroque art. First of all, let me go to what's written on the bottom of this slide. We're going to make it dramatic. We're going to make it dramatic. It's not going to be intellectual. It's going to be a story. It's going to be something that you can look at, like this particular image here, which tells the story of Samson and Delilah from the Bible. And you've got a story just looking at it. So it's something you want to look at, and it's something that you want to understand. This is good if you are illiterate and you can't read the Bible. And this is going to entrance you and make you interested in Catholicism, far more than a bare church is going to be like the Protestants have. The other aspect of Baroque art is something called chiaroscuro, and there chiaroscuro is written on the slide. Chiaro is the Italian word for light, and scuro is the Italian word for dark. So extreme contrast between light and dark help dramatize a particular image. And I don't think we see that all that well in this particular image, but we will in another future image. Just to accentuate this point even more, think about like what you would prefer. Would you prefer to read about Daniel and the lion's den, or would you prefer to look at the image? Protestants say it's better to read because that's God speaking directly to you. The Catholics say, no, 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 you can still have a great image that represents the same idea, and images are worth 1,000 words, and images can bring you to Christ too. There are two great Baroque artists that I'm going to talk about here, both of which are men and both live in Italy. There's a very important female Baroque artist that I'll talk about later. The first is this man, Caravaggio. Caravaggio is absolutely amazing on several levels. First of all, he used live models, like most artists did. He would bring people in, but he would bring people in off the street. And Caravaggio was a bit of a thug. He was a poor guy, and he enjoyed hanging out with gangsters, literally gangsters on the street of Rome. Some of his female friends were prostitutes, and he probably was not unknown to the brothels of Rome. He hung out with a rough crowd and with a lowly crowd, and he's bringing these people in to use as models for biblical images that he's going to paint. So you can hopefully already see the controversy with Caravaggio. Caravaggio also was he was probably a sociopath. He was a murderer. He spent part of his life on the run from the law. He was a bad boy. And so it seems it's very difficult for some people to put their head around it, or to kind of grapple with this or understand this, that here was a guy who was a murderer and spent times with whores, and yet painted these incredible images that are Christian. So knowing this about Caravaggio's background gives us a little bit of a deeper insight into the stuff that he painted. This is Baroque art. This is Doubting Thomas, who says, I will believe that Jesus is resurrected when Jesus is standing right in front of me and I can put my finger in his wounds. And so here we have Doubting Thomas having his finger jammed into the side of a resurrected Christ. Look at Doubting Thomas. Look at his face, first of all. This is not a handsome man. This is an old guy with blotches on his face. These are real people. Look at his shirt. It's torn. And then, man, how can you not look at his finger getting jammed into Jesus' side, into the wound from being crucified? So this is a very, very, very powerful image. Hopefully you also see the contrast between dark and light, the chiaroscuro. This is another painting that Caravaggio that Caravaggio painted. This is the calling of St. Matthew. This is when Jesus calls Matthew to follow him, to be a disciple. And Jesus is interesting in this particular painting. First of all, he's over on the right, and he's in the shadow. And you can't see most of Jesus' body. That is truly chiaroscuro. You see his face, you see his arm, you see his finger pointing at St. Matthew. And Matthew is busy counting money. He's a tax collector. He's not a great guy. Also, what's interesting about this image is they are dressed in modern Italian clothes. So it's not really biblical clothes, which means that, for the Italians looking at it, it's the Gospels are happening right here, right now. So this is the calling of St. Matthew. Also by Caravaggio is the assassination or the martyrdom of St. Matthew. And this is an intense painting. According to Catholic lore, Matthew went to Egypt to convert the pagans in Egypt. And while he was conducting Mass in a church, he was assassinated. Now look at this particular painting. The focus of this painting is not St. Matthew. He is on the ground about ready to get killed. The focus of this painting is the hitman, the guy with the sword in his right hand about ready to kill St. Matthew. So what an incredible painting to get people to come to Jesus, to have them believe in the Gospels. The focus of this painting is an assassination. So it's very dramatic. Nothing like this happened in the Renaissance. And the last painting, which is also very famous from Caravaggio that I'm going to show you, is this one. We've looked at a lot of Davids before. This is Caravaggio's David with Head of Goliath. And you can think about how different this David is compared to Michelangelo's David or Donatello's David. This one is David having killed Goliath and is holding up his head, and he's looking down sympathetically at Goliath. He's sad for Goliath. And what's intense about this particular painting is that the head of Goliath is in fact a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And I think a lot of historians have interpreted this in this way. Caravaggio painted this at the end of his life. It's one of the very last things that he painted. And he probably felt extraordinarily guilty and sad for all the sins he'd committed in life. And when he paints himself, he does not paint himself as the hero. He paints himself as the monster. He paints himself as Goliath. The next artist I want to talk about is a sculptor of the Baroque movement. He comes around a little bit after Caravaggio, and his name is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Here's Bernini. He's a sculptor. And so the first thing I'd like to show you with Bernini and what he does for the Baroque movement to bring people back to the Roman Catholic Church is he does this. So what you're looking at is an aerial view of St. Peter's Basilica. And you see the basilica right there, and there's the big dome that Michelangelo made. And then check out the colonnade, the columns, reaching out in front of St. Peter's Basilica. All of that was designed by Bernini. And as you look at it, you can see this. It's supposed to be the Roman Catholic Church extending its arms to the people coming to visit. So if you are a Catholic and you walk to St. Peter's, you walk through Bernini's colonnade, and really this is supposed to symbolize the Roman Catholic Church giving you a big hug as you walk in. I just thought I would put in here also just a couple of little details. There's the Sistine Chapel, so you know where Michelangelo's Last Judgment and the Sistine Chapel ceiling is in relation to St. Peter's, and it's, right there. And then there's the Apostolic Library where Raphael's School of Athens would be located. All right, so brace yourself here. I'm going to give you an up-close detail of one of Bernini's sculptures, and hopefully just by looking at this you can be like, wow, Bernini truly is one of the greatest sculptors in all of all time, in a way that's, maybe even better than Michelangelo. This is very much a Renaissance-type sculpture. This is a sculpture of, and it's a detail obviously, of Zeus grabbing a woman. And look at that. That is marble. But look at how the fingers go into the flesh. So a couple things to think about here. One, how realistic is that? And realistic in a way that's different from Michelangelo. It's not, you think about Michelangelo's David as static and strong and tough, and he's leaning to the side, but it's sort of like this solid human form. This is like flesh pressing into flesh, and that's something different altogether. And there's twisting going on. It's also, and let's just be honest here, a very sexual image too. It's a man grabbing onto a woman in a very intimate way. And this is what Bernini got known for. So, bearing those things in mind, very fleshy, very sexual, it's very interesting that Bernini was asked to sculpt something very important in the Counter-Reformation movement. He was asked to make a sculpture of St. Teresa of Avila. And when making this sculpture, he read this that we have already read about an angel plunging its spear into the guts of St. Teresa of Avila. And he sculpts this for a church. And this is the only image I'm going to show you of this. It does this sculpture no justice because it's a three-dimensional image and it's just an amazing thing to look at from a wide variety of angles. But this is Saint Teresa. I'm sorry, this is the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. So take a moment to look at it, and I am done. Eurobears, thanks for putting up with me. Hope you learned a little something about the Counter-Reformation.